Book 3, Chapters 9 and 10 of Stolen Idols. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stolen Idols by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. Book 3, Chapter 9. Mr. Johnson returned to find a motor car standing outside his door, and Major Holmes with a subordinate in colloquy with Morton. He led them himself to the library, showed them the door with its picked lock, the empty coffer, and the window on the ground floor through which the marauder had made an easy entrance. The Chief Constable was perplexed. "You are only a subtenant here, I understand, Mr. Johnson?" he asked. "Only a subtenant," the latter acknowledged. "And you yourself have never been in this room? I gather that it was locked up by Miss Endicott's instructions." "Quite so." "Then you really don't know what has been taken?" "The contents of the coffer, evidently," Mr. Johnson replied. "It was always understood that it contained Chinese manuscripts which Mr. Endicott brought home with him from abroad." There was a moment's silence. Then Major Holmes continued. "I have told Inspector XIII here," he said, "of your visit to me." "And of my suspicions?" "Yes." The inspector coughed. He had a heavy but ingenuous countenance. Disbelief was stamped upon it. "Will you gentlemen follow me?" Mr. Johnson invited. He led them on to the lawn, well away from the house. At a safe distance he came to a standstill and pointed to the library. "Endicott," he said, "was murdered for the possession of that other wooden image and for the manuscript which indicated the whereabouts of the jewels. The object of the murder was achieved in part. A wooden image was taken. You will find it now at Ballaston Hall. For some reason or another the murderer failed to secure the document. He probably heard some movement in the house. The burglary last night was undertaken to secure it. Nothing else was touched, but the manuscripts are missing. The only person to whom the manuscripts are useful is the possessor of the images." Inspector XIII stroked his chin thoughtfully. He looked across towards the great front of the hall. His was not the type of brain to quickly absorb suspicion, and much of this talk concerning wooden images and Chinese manuscripts he looked upon as fantastic, almost as fantastic as the idea that a member of one of the great county families whom he revered could so far forget their lofty station as to commit a misdemeanour under the shadow of the law. Crime, in Inspector XIII's opinion, was for the criminals. The idea of a Ballaston as a criminal was grotesque. "You refer to the Ballastons," Major Holmes observed after a pause. Mr. Johnson inclined his head. "I refer to the Ballastons," he assented. "Wait, please, a moment." Morton came towards them, followed by the young man who was interested in moths. Mr. Johnson welcomed him pleasantly, but with no indication of intimacy. "Glad to see you, Fielding," he said. "I sent word down that those trout flies had arrived. I'll show them to you directly. That will do, Morton." The butler departed. Mr. Johnson turned to the Chief Constable. "This is Mr. Fielding," he announced. "He is a member of the firm of Watts and Fielding, private enquiry agents. He has been staying in the neighbourhood for the last month, making a few investigations for me." The relations between the accredited representatives of the law and a private enquiry agent were scarcely likely to be cordial. Major Holmes, however, nodded slightly. "To some extent, as I told you, I have been anticipating last night's visit," Mr. Johnson continued. "Mr. Fielding, therefore, has spent a considerable portion of his time after midnight watching the egress from the hall. He will tell you that this morning a man slipped out of one of the side entrances, a door, in fact, which opened from the small library into the garden, at 3:10, and that he followed him to this house." "Is that a fact?" the Chief Constable asked gravely. "That is a fact," Fielding replied. "I am prepared to swear to it." "Did you recognize the man?" Major Holmes enquired. The other shook his head. "I was obeying orders in keeping strictly out of sight," he explained. "I was not near enough to recognize him. Once before some one left by the same door at about the same time, but he looked behind in the park and saw me, so nothing happened." "If you saw this person enter these premises at that hour of the morning," the Chief Constable enquired, "why did you not follow in case Mr. Johnson needed assistance?" "My express orders were that he should do nothing of the sort," the latter intervened. "I wished for many reasons to keep the matter in my own hands. I have been used to scraps," he went on, "in every part of the world. I understand jiu jitsu, boxing, and how to draw a gun as quickly as any one. I never dreamed that I might be outwitted. The visitor from the Hall who stole the manuscripts last night was too clever for me." "Now, sir," Mr. Johnson continued impressively, "I want everything done in an orthodox fashion. And I know very well your prejudice, and a very natural one, against the interference of private detectives. Mr. Fielding will withdraw from the case from now onwards, but I do expect that, on the basis of the information you have already received, you will at once proceed with the necessary inquiries." "I have no alternative but to do so," the Chief Constable admitted reluctantly. "I must warn you, however, that I shall do so in the manner which seems to me the most desirable. I shall approach Sir Bertram himself." "You will use your own discretion, of course," Mr. Johnson said, "but action must be taken at once. There mustn't be time for anyone to slip off abroad or anything of that sort. And I want you to remember this, Major. When you found last night's burglar, and that ought not to be a difficult job, you should also be able to solve the mystery of my poor friend Endicott's murder." "That may be so, Mr. Johnson," the other answered a little sadly. "I can only say that I sincerely hope not. We shall probably meet later in the day." "I shall be here or in the neighbourhood," the other promised. The Chief Constable and his subordinate entered the car and drove off. They swung round the corner of the lane, and a dozen curious pairs of eyes saw them turn in at the park gates. "What do you think of this, Cloutson?" the former asked. "Bunkum," was the prompt reply. "That's what I think, bunkum. And between you and me, Major, I don't think much of that fellow Johnson. A stranger to the neighbourhood. No one knows anything about him. Come here for God knows why, and spinning yarns like this. Bunkum is what I think of it. And as for this burglar, who else except that pettifogging enquiry agent saw anyone leave the great house? Not a soul. We've heard of jobs, Major, done from the inside, done by the victim, haven't we? Those manuscripts, or whatever he calls them, were just as likely to be valuable to Johnson as to anyone else. Supposing he wanted them? Well, he's gone the best way he could to help himself. If you ask me what I think about our present errand, sir, I should call it a mare's nest, nothing more nor less. My idea of the job is to get Mr. Johnson's dossier and search the Great House." The Chief Constable smiled. He had not fully confided in his subordinate. Yet when he came to reflect upon the matter, Mr. Johnson's bona fides had not yet been established. In the depths of his companion's bucolic mind might lurk, after all, the germ of truth. End of Book 3, Chapter 9. Book 3, Chapter 10. So far as the countenance of so perfect a servant as Rawson could betray any expression at all, there was both welcome and a suggestion of hospitality in his manner as he received the callers. Certainly, Sir Bertram was in, Mr. Gregory was in, and Mr. Henry was in. Sir Bertram appeared almost at that moment coming out of the gun room with a rook rifle under his arm. "Hullo, Major," he exclaimed genially. "Glad to see you. Warned in for lunch, I hope?" "Very much obliged, Sir Bertram," was the somewhat hesitating reply. "To tell you the truth—" "Ah, business, I see," the other interrupted. "Come along to my den. It is so long since I signed a warrant that upon my word I forgot I was a magistrate. Bring the inspector with you if you want him." He led the way to a small and seldom used room, plainly furnished, where he was accustomed at times to interview a tenant, seated himself on an uncomfortable chair before a formal looking desk, and pointed to an easy chair for his visitor. "Nothing serious, I hope?" he inquired. Major Holmes waited until the door was closed. "Sir Bertram," he began, "you have no doubt heard of the burglary at the Great House." "My dear Major," was the somewhat reproachful reply, "this is a country village in Norfolk, and the burglary happened as long ago as last night. I have heard 7 versions of the affair, and been given the names of at least 7 suspectedly guilty parties." "I have come to call upon you in connection with that affair," Major Holmes continued. "There is a person willing to declare upon oath that a quarter of an hour before the burglary occurred last night, some one was seen to leave your house and enter the grounds of the Great House through a gap in the hedge beyond the stable wall." Sir Bertram sat quite still for a moment. Then his lips protruded slightly and he whistled. "Well, that's the 8th version," he observed. "I like the last one, Holmes. Spicy, to say the least of it." "This is not hearsay," the Chief Constable went on. "I have seen the witness myself and heard the story from his own lips. I come to you, naturally, for help, Sir Bertram. I want a list of your male domestics, and I wish to know from your staff whether any one was known or heard to leave this house last night." "Simple as ABC," Sir Bertram declared, ringing the bell. "Rawson keeps tabs on them all. We've a couple of lads, under footmen I suppose they'd call themselves, whom I don't know much about. The others are about as likely to commit a burglary as I should be to rob a hen roost." "Send Rawson to me," he ordered the man who answered the bell. It was a matter of seconds only before the butler made his appearance. His master leaned back in his chair as he questioned him. "Rawson," he asked, "do you know any man, who could have left this house between midnight and 3 or say 4 o'clock this morning?" "Certainly not, sir," was the confident reply. "You didn't hear any unusual sound in the night, like a door opening or anything of that sort?" "Nothing, Sir Bertram." "If you were told that some one had left this house at about 3 o'clock and gone down to the Great House, what should you have to say about it?" "I should say that it was impossible, sir," Rawson asserted. "As you are aware, sir, I sleep in my own quarters adjoining the butler's pantry on the ground floor. My window and door were both wide open last night, and I am a light sleeper. I was not once disturbed." Sir Bertram turned to the Chief Constable. "Did your informant specify the door which was made use of?" "It was the door opening from the smaller library." Sir Bertram glanced towards Rawson. "See if that door is fastened," he directed. "Here, you'd better take the inspector with you." The 2 men left the room. Sir Bertram tapped a cigarette upon the table and lit it. "Where did you get hold of this cock and bull story, Holmes?" he asked. The Chief Constable frowned. "From a perfectly reliable source," he replied. "I have no doubt that Rawson is honest, but I shall want the names of all your servants. I shall also require to interview them all." Sir Bertram smiled. "Lord love us, you don't suppose I want to stand in the way of your duty, Holmes," he said. "When Rawson comes back you shall have them all up one by one and put them all through the mill. By the by, there was nothing much stolen, was there? I understand the burglar had only tumbled out a coffer full of manuscripts." "The manuscripts themselves are missing," Major Holmes confided. "I have seen the lot," Sir Bertram observed carelessly. "Some of them were very curious. There wasn't one of them worth 6pence intrinsically. Endacott was supposed to have one telling us all about the treasure in my Buddha heads, but it never materialized." Rawson returned in due course, preceded by the inspector. "The door is properly locked on the inside, sir," the latter announced. "There are no evidences of any one having used that way out into the grounds lately." "So that's that," Sir Bertram observed, with a little shrug of the shoulders. "How many servants are there sleeping in the house?" Major Holmes enquired. 11, sir," Rawson answered. "I shall require to interview each one of them." "Get along with it then," Sir Bertram assented resignedly. "Don't forget we lunch at 1. Rawson had better take you round to the servants' quarters. When Major Holmes has finished, Rawson, bring him out on to the lawn and serve some sherry." He dismissed them all carelessly with a little wave of the hand, waited until the door was closed, waited some minutes afterwards before his expression changed or a sound escaped from his lips. Then he rose slowly to his feet, lit another cigarette, and looked reproachfully at his shaking fingers. "What a nerve these great criminals must have," he murmured to himself as he strolled out into the hall. "Henry! Hullo, Henry!" A still, motionless figure stood in the shadow of the staircase on the first landing, looking downward, a figure so still that except for his clothes he might have stepped out of one of the frames which lined the wall. "Are you coming down, or going up, or rooted?" Sir Bertram enquired. "I will descend," Henry Ballaston replied. He came down the stairs with slow yet even footsteps, one hand always upon the carved balustrade. "I heard voices," he said. "Holmes is here from Norwich," Sir Bertram confided, "and the immortal Cloutson with him. You know, the travelling inspector for the district. They have an idea that some one crossed the park from the Hall last night." "In connection, I presume, with the burglary at the Great House," Henry observed. His brother nodded. "A silly business. Have you seen anything of Gregory?" "Not since breakfast time. He spoke of going to Norwich. He found he wanted another trunk." Sir Bertram sighed. The brothers walked out together through the fine Gothic side entrance which led on to the lawns and gardens. "You had no communication from Mr. Borroughes this morning, I suppose?" Henry Ballaston asked, a little hesitatingly. "Nothing," was the level reply. "There was a letter from Kershaw, the lawyer fellow of whom Emily spoke so highly. He said that he had studied the position from every point of view, and regretted to find that he could discover no means remaining by which sufficient money to pay the overdue interest on the first mortgage could be legitimately raised. The timber will be the only thing, and the timber is Ballaston." "The timber is sacred," Henry agreed. "Has Mr. Kershaw examined the position so far as regards the Romneys and the 3 Gainsboroughs?" "Heirlooms, just the same as the others. They are not to be touched." The brothers stood side by side upon the lawn, their faces turned towards the house. Sir Bertram was his usual cool and gracious self. Henry had somehow or other a suggestion of suspended life in his colourless face, his stiff attitude, his cold eyes. "Major Holmes is examining the servants?" he enquired. "That was his idea." "Will he wait until Gregory returns?" "Very likely. As I think I told you, they seem to have come across some one who can swear that they saw a man leaving the Hall last night, just before the burglary took place." "But there was no actual burglary," Henry objected. "A quantity of documents appear to be missing," Sir Bertram confided. "Holmes's attitude seemed to me a little suspicious. I fancy that some one has been getting at him. I'm not sure. I must confess to having some doubts about this man Johnson." "Doubts? Explain yourself, Bertram." "Johnson's account of himself has never been an entirely credible one. Do you remember the day when he lunched here and he saw the Images?" "He certainly betrayed surprise," Henry reflected. "Gregory has a queer idea about it, although it only made us laugh at the time. He said he reminded him of the Chinaman who saved his life on the Yonsei River, and who was an important person in the firm of Johnson and Company." "Mr. Johnson is not a Chinaman," Henry Ballaston replied confidently. His brother took his arm and moved towards the house. Major Holmes was standing in the entrance. "No," Sir Bertram agreed, "but the Chinaman might have been Mr. Johnson." End of Book 3, Chapter 10. Book 3, Chapter 11 of Stolen Idols. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stolen Idols by E. Phillips Oppenheim, Book 3, Chapter 11. The Chief Constable had little to report, but his air of uneasy disquietude remained. "I think," he announced, "that so far as I can make out, the servants are all right. Curiously enough, however, it seems that Gregory has a key to the door in question, which he uses sometimes." "Very probable," Sir Bertram assented. "He likes to come and go out of the house at all times." "I wonder when he'll be back?" Major Holmes enquired. "He had very little to do," his father observed. "Found himself a trunk short or something of that sort. I thought he had bought all his outfit in London, but I suppose he miscalculated." "When does he go abroad?" "Saturday week. Sails from Liverpool to Montreal, I think, by an Allan liner." "The county will miss him," the Chief Constable remarked, as he accepted a glass of sherry from the tray which Rawson had just brought out. "So, I am afraid, shall I," Sir Bertram admitted. "It is one of the signs of approaching age when one begins to rely upon other people. I remember the time when I used to find it devilish uncomfortable to have a grown-up son. To-day, well, I would rather there were something he could do in England. Shall we go in, Major? No use waiting for Gregory. He's just as likely as not to lunch in Norwich." Luncheon was at times a difficult function. Holmes was in a sense an unwilling guest, and Sir Bertram was unusually silent. It was Henry, with his stilted phrases and old-fashioned sense of the obligations of a host, who kept the conversation going. Towards the end of the meal Gregory put in an unexpected appearance. He shook hands with Holmes, of whose presence he had obviously been informed, and apologized to his father. "So sorry, Dad," he explained. "It took me some time to find just the trunk I wanted, and then I remembered that I had ordered some riding kit at Houghton's, and I thought I might as well be tried on. Any news about the burglary, Major?" "Nothing of any moment at present," the latter replied. Gregory busied himself for some time with his lunch whilst the others loitered. Afterwards they strolled out on to the lawn together for a coffee. As soon as it was served, Holmes set down his cup and faced the situation. "Gregory," he said, "I know you will remember that, as well as being your friend, and I hope the friend of every one here, I am a Government official." Gregory paused in the act of lighting a cigarette and stared at him. "Why, that's all right," he assented. "What about it?" "The police have evidence," Major Holmes continued, "that at about 3 o'clock this morning, that is to say 20 minutes or so before the burglary at the Great House was committed, some one was seen to leave the Hall, cross the park and enter the Great House, or at any rate to disappear in that neighbourhood." Gregory finished lighting his cigarette. "Where on earth did the police get hold of their information?" he enquired. "From a poacher?" "From a person whose word it would be a little difficult to upset," the Chief Constable replied. "Acting on his information, I have come up here to pay an official visit. I have interviewed all the servants without result. I understand that you possess a key to the smaller library door which you sometimes use." "I often use it," Gregory admitted. "If I dine out or anything of that sort, or come home by the mail from London, I use it to avoid undoing all the bolts of the front door." "Where was the key last night? Anywhere where any one could have got hold of it?" "I shouldn't have thought so. It's in my dressing room somewhere." "You didn't lend it to any one?" "Certainly not. No one has ever asked me for it." "You didn't use it yourself?" "Last night? No, I haven't used it for weeks." Major Holmes nodded. "Well," he said, "that's that. I now appeal to you all. Can you help me? A reliable witness states that some one left the Hall through that library door last night, was seen to walk across the park and, to all reasonable supposition, was the person who assaulted and chloroformed Mr. Johnson and committed the burglary. You will realize that this is a serious statement. Can any of you suggest anything which might throw light upon the affair?" "All that I can suggest," Gregory remarked, "is that your informant must have been seeing spooks. Who is he? One of the villagers?" There need no longer be any secret about his identity, Major Holmes decided. Our informant is a private detective employed by Mr. Johnson. There was an intense and ominous silence. Henry Ballaston drew his chair a little further back into the shade, as though he suddenly felt the sun too strong. Sir Bertram whistled softly, but for once in his life seemed guilty of an almost unnatural action. Gregory stood as though turned to stone. Across his face for a moment there flitted an expression of dismay. The Chief Constable saw it, and his heart sank. It was Sir Bertram's brain which moved the quickest. How the mischief did this Mr. Johnson get hold of a private detective at a moment's notice? He inquired. He has had him in the neighbourhood for some time, Major Holmes replied. His presence in the park last night was not accidental. He was employed by Mr. Johnson in connection with certain theories which he, Johnson, held as to the murder of Mr. Endicott. "This is all most amazing," Sir Bertram observed. "A very curious action on the part of a man who is a total stranger to the neighbourhood," Henry put in. The Chief Constable brooded for several moments. His official duty was hard to follow. The whole circumstances were unusual. He faced the situation from the common sense point of view. "Johnson may be a stranger to the neighbourhood," he admitted, "but I do not think his appearance here is so entirely casual as he tried to make out. It transpires that he was a partner of Endicott's in the great firm of Johnson and Company. I believe that the real object of his coming here was to solve the mystery of Endicott's murder." "Wu Ling, my God!" Gregory exclaimed in genuine excitement. "The moment I saw him I thought I recognized him. Then it seemed incredible. Why, of course, I was a fool ever to doubt it," he went on. "He played the Chinaman out there to do his trading up in the villages. He had lived there most of his life. It was easy enough. Then when he finished with the business and came back here, he Europeanized himself. My God, what a fool I have been!" "I don't know anything about that," Major Holmes observed. "He came to me in Norwich a short time ago, and he placed before me some very serious information. I am using my own discretion in what I am about to say. By now you must know just what I am up against. Again I appeal to you for your help." In the background Henry shook his head gravely. Sir Bertram, with the slightest possible shrug of the shoulders, turned away and lit a cigarette. Gregory, completely at his ease again, lolled a little deeper in his wicker chair. "My dear fellow," he expostulated, "how the deuce can any of us help you? I tell you frankly, if any one left the house last night, and I don't believe they did, I for one don't know anything about it. As to the murder, well, if Mr. Johnson's private agent can find out anything about that, the whole neighbourhood will be indebted to him. How on earth is he likely to succeed, however, when you and Scotland Yard have failed?" "The murder, so far as our investigations took us," Major Holmes said patiently, "was entirely lacking in direct motive. The burglary, on the contrary, does seem to have had an extraordinary but clear object. The burglar got away with a number of Chinese manuscripts. Among these manuscripts—" "I know what you are going to say," Gregory interrupted, smiling as though in amusement, "but you're wrong all the same. Old Endicott had been through them. There wasn't one which could help the owner of the Images to discover the treasure." "Where are these infernal Images?" Major Holmes asked. "They have been moved upstairs into my apartments," Henry Ballaston intervened. "If it would afford you any satisfaction to inspect them, I will take you there with pleasure." "I should like to see them," Major Holmes decided. They all returned to the house, Gregory quitting his chair with an air of reluctance. The two Images stood in a small sitting room opening out from Henry Ballaston's bedroom at the top of the house, an apartment of extraordinary, almost monastic simplicity. They stood side by side on an old black oak bureau, and against the white of the walls they showed up with almost glaring effect. "The body and the soul," Gregory pointed out. "I don't think they have ever been worth what poor old Bill Hammond and I went through for them. They got Bill, too. Good chap he was." "The legend is," Sir Bertram explained politely, "that those heads are filled with jewels. Yet we have never been able to discover an opening or aperture of any sort." "If there is any truth in the story," Major Holmes suggested, "why don't you break them up?" Sir Bertram shivered. "That at least," he said, "one would keep for a last effort. Those images, Holmes, are nearly 1,000 years old, and if you are any judge of such things, you will see at once that they were carved by a great artist. With their history, I should imagine that their value at Christie's would be at least several £1,000s each, so long as they are intact." Major Holmes took one into his hands and set it down again, amazed at the weight. "Why, they're almost as heavy as bronze!" he exclaimed. "The wood of which they are fashioned is a species of teak wood, almost extinct now," Sir Bertram explained. "Their weight, of course, is rather an argument against their being hollow. On the other hand, they might be hollow and filled with jewels." "There is a further legend," Gregory confided, "that there is inside some sort of infernal machine invented during the last century by the priests, which would go off at any rough usage. That, I must say, seems to me a bit thick. At the same time, the Chinese were always rather great at explosives." "I imagine," Major Holmes said, "that you will not let this superstition stand in your way, provided you are unable to discover the secret opening." "As a last resort," Sir Bertram declared, "we have decided to destroy the less pleasing of the images." "And I," Gregory announced in a low tone, his eyes fixed upon the leering image of the body, "mean to be the one to strike the blow. One gets kind of superstitious over there, you know, Holmes," he went on. "I lost possession of the other image for a time. The robbers got off with it when they raided the train and killed poor old Hammond, but that unpleasing looking devil I brought home with me. All I can say is that I don't want to be left alone with him again for a month or 6 weeks. You wouldn't have much chance, would you, at the Norwich Assizes, if you pleaded that you'd been driven to commit a murder through the influence of an image? A Chinese judge would have understood it. All I know is that on that boat I was never myself." "And here?" Holmes asked curiously. "I kept out of the way of the thing when it was once here," Gregory replied. "Uncle Henry took care of it then, and I think it would take more than the power of an image to move him from the paths of rectitude. Then, through old Endicott, by the by, we got hold of the other one. So now I don't mind. It's only when he's out of reach of the soul that that chap's supposed to do any harm." "You were lucky to regain possession of the other image," the Chief Constable observed, after a moment's pause. "Through Mr. Endicott, I think you said?" "In a sort of way," Gregory answered coldly. "You couldn't be a little more explicit?" the other persisted. The silence which followed was portentous, charged with electricity. It was Sir Bertram who laid his hand gently upon his son's shoulder. "Gregory is rather sensitive about this business," he said. "Considering all he went through, I do not wonder at it. If it ever becomes expedient for us to explain exactly how the second image came into our possession, we will do so. That moment scarcely seems to have yet arrived." Major Holmes abandoned the subject a little abruptly. He walked along the great corridor, with its rows of pictures upon one side and mullioned windows on the other, speechless and absorbed. The whole place seemed flooded with afternoon sunshine which found its way into the gloomiest corners, touching some old suits of armour with a gleam of fire, tracing zigzag hieroglyphics upon the smooth white stone floor. He had made up his mind what course of action to adopt, and it had not been an easy task. He sent for Inspector Cloutson, and stood making his adieux to his hosts. At the last minute he drew Gregory on one side. "I hear you are starting off on another of your long rambles, Gregory," he said. "Something a little more permanent this time. I'm going to try the Far West first, lose myself for a year or two. Nothing definite seems to be known just yet, but there are rumours that there have been some big finds of gold right up the Yukon. If I don't have any luck, I shall come back and try ranching. I've got a job out there." "It's true, then, what they are saying?" Major Holmes continued diffidently. "Things here are pretty bad?" "Rotten," Gregory admitted. Unless a miracle happens, such as those jewels materializing, or something of that sort, Ballaston must go before the autumn. It is bad news," the other sighed. "It is almost a tragedy. Enough to drive anyone crazy," he added, his rather kindly eyes resting for a moment upon Gregory's face. "I'm going to give you a word of advice, if I may. We were at school together, and I practically owe my position here to your father. I shall have to settle with my conscience for saying it. I may decide to chuck up my job, but I'm going to say it. If you've got your kit ready, move off. I don't like the look of things down here for you. That's all." For a moment Gregory was speechless, not exactly from surprise, but from some mixture of emotions which found outlet in speech difficult. Then he suddenly shook the hand which Holmes had extended and wrung it. "You're a good fellow, Holmes," he said. "I don't like the look of things myself, and that's a fact. I may pop off if I see my way clear. If I don't, well, you won't have any disagreeable duties to perform at the Castle. I'll promise you that." The inspector put in his appearance, and the two men took their leave. Gregory remained for a few minutes motionless upon the broad semicircle of white stone stretching out from the front door, gazing after the receding car. Presently his father moved up to his side. "Holmes seems to have a bee in his bonnet, Gregory," he ventured tentatively. Gregory nodded. "He's a good fellow," he declared. "It cost him something to do it, I know, but he's given me the office. Advised me to clear out within the next 24 hours. It's that fellow Johnson." "Well, if you've made up your mind to go," Sir Bertram said, "why not? They can't do anything in a desperate hurry, and you'll get a run for your money, at least, out there." Gregory seemed for a moment puzzled, then distressed. He turned and looked at his father. Sir Bertram's expression, however, was inscrutable. Finally he swung on his heel. "At any rate," he decided, "I'll finish my packing." End of Book 3, Chapter 11. Book 3, Chapter 12 of Stolen Idols. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stolen Idols by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. Book 3, Chapter 12. "Things do be happening round about here, for sure," Mr. Pank remarked, as he moved down the whisky bottle from its shelf. "What it all may lead to is more than a body can say, but I don't like the look of it, Mr. Craske." The grocer added less than his usual modicum of water to his whisky. His aspect was gloomy. So also were the aspects of Mr. Franks, the butcher, who had strolled across for news, and Walter Bevans, the wheelwright, who had come on a similar errand. "It's almost as bad," Mr. Craske declared, "as the week after the murder. Every one went about then, as it were, on tiptoe. Now this burglary, taken by itself, ain't anything to make special mention of. Why, Mr. Johnson himself, he was in the morning after it happened, and he treated it mostly as a joke." "It's my belief," Mr. Pank announced, "that there's something more serious brewing. There's Inspector Cloutson come to stop in the village. There's Major Holmes, the Chief Constable, up and down from the Hall all day. There's Mr. Johnson, he don't come near any more. Mr. Fielding, him we took for a schoolmaster, and whom they do say was a kind of detective, he ain't been in. And Mr. Rawson, why no one ain't seen him for 4 days. We shall have news before long, and bad news, I'm afraid it may be." "There's wild talk going about," Mr. Craske sighed, "and what it may mean no one can say for sure. But what I do say is, reason is reason, and is it likely that any one here could have a grudge against a poor old harmless fellow like Mr. Endacott? All this talk of images and Chinese documents and such like seems as though it had come out of the pages of one of those serial novels as folks read in the newspapers. I don't take no stock of such stuff." Mr. Franks pushed his tankard across to be refilled. "There's one bit of bad news, at any rate, may be sprung upon us at any moment," he said. "They do say that every servant in the Hall had a month's notice yesterday. I heard that from Miss Shane, the housekeeper's niece." The landlord shook his head gloomily. "Things do seem to be pointing that way," he admitted, "and Mr. Rawson keeping away and all. If so be that it's true, it will be a sad loss. The Squire be a proud man in his way, but he be a true gentleman, and so be Mr. Henry, and a more popular young gent than Mr. Gregory has never been known in the county. It's a wonderful property to have to give up." "We'll get some one here, I suppose," Mr. Craske predicted pessimistically, "who's made pots of money by being careful, and goes on saving pots the same way. Some of those big houses, the way they do go through their books and talk about the stores to you. Why, here's Mr. Rawson." The butler entered, solemn, ponderous, and dignified as ever. He raised his black bowler hat in acknowledgment of the greetings which assailed him from all sides, and sank slowly into a chair. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," he said. "Mr. Pank, I'll take double my usual quantity of Scotch whisky." "With me, Mr. Rawson," the grocer insisted. "We've missed you the last few days." Rawson sighed. "I felt too worried in my mind for company," he confessed. "It's no secret to you all, so why should I act mysterious about it? There's scary doings at the Hall." There was a little rustle of interest. Rawson, disposed for gossip, waited until his drink was placed in his hand, and solemnly pledged its donor. "To begin with," he confided, "it's no secret now that we're in trouble. We may have acted foolish," he went on. "Nothing, of course, can be said for £70,000 lost at Newmarket, and a trifle more than that last year. Foolish we may have been, but the gentry have always had their weaknesses. The hounds have cost us a cool £8,000 a year for the last 5 years, and subscriptions getting less all the time. Then the taxes. It seems whatever sort of government we get these days, they want your money, fingers all itching for it, get you always. Income tax and land tax. Why, it's a wonder they don't grab the breath out of your body. It's the first time such a thing's happened to me in my career, but last night, you'll believe me, gentlemen, I had my notice." There was a murmur of sympathy. Rawson raised his glass and drank. "It was Mr. Henry, as usual, who had to tackle the job," he continued. "He sent for us one by one to his study, where he sat as prim and formal as ever, with all his catalogues around and his books of reference. 'Rawson,' he said, 'you have been an excellent servant, but conditions render it necessary for my brother and me to close this house for the present. We are, in fact, ceasing to keep an establishment. I am compelled, therefore, to ask you to accept a month's notice.' All very proper and regular, gentlemen, but I could see that Mr. Henry were feeling it. Mrs. Shane came out all crying. I seen him afterwards, though, and he were just the same as usual, except that his face were as white as parchment." "It do be a sad loss for all," Mr. Pank declared. "There's no word of anything but good in these parts for any of them, for the Squire or Mr. Henry or Mr. Gregory either." "As though this weren't trouble enough," Rawson proceeded portentously, "there's all sorts of mysterious doings and rumours afloat, about enough to drive a body crazy. You mind the young man Fielding, who called himself a retired schoolmaster and sat in the corner pretending to make flies?" "The hypocrite!" Mr. Craske exclaimed. "A detective, that's what he was," Rawson went on. "Not a police detective, you understand, but one of them that goes about spying for a living. Now he is up and swore that the night of the burglary he seen some one leave the Hall by the oak library, which is Mr. Gregory's private way almost, 20 minutes or half an hour before the burglary were committed." There was a little buzz of exclamations and remarks, a general feeling of indignation against the pseudo schoolmaster. "If he were one of these paid spies," Mr. Craske enquired, "who were paying him?" "That I can't say for sure," the butler acknowledged, "but I have my suspicions, very grave suspicions too." "And whom might you be fancying to be the man, Mr. Rawson?" one of the little group asked. "Him as has taken the Great House, Mr. Johnson by name," was the injured reply. "We've had him up to lunch, too, and treated him, as it were, beyond his station. I'm glad to find he's not here to day, gentlemen. There's a word or two I might have had to say to him." "It do seem most mysterious," the innkeeper declared. "What do you suppose this Mr. Johnson has got to do with it all, Mr. Rawson, that he's putting his oar in?" "Mr. Johnson," the butler announced, "has come to these parts under false pretences. There's many has wondered why he settled here, and many asked him the question, and all the time he answered innocent like that he just wanted the country, and the house suited him, and so on. Do you mind, all on you, when he pretended to be surprised about the murder? He knew about it all the time. He was Mr. Endicott's partner out somewhere in foreign parts, and he settled down here in a mischievous kind of way to make trouble and disturbance amongst his betters." "Well, I never!" Mr. Pank exclaimed. "A pleasanter spoken body never came in the place, or a more harmless looking. There's nothing fresh, is there, Mr. Rawson, about the murder?" "God knows," was the butler's ponderous pronouncement. "There's strange things all around us, and what they may mean or where they may lead to, we none of us can tell at this present moment." "There's Mr. Johnson," the grocer exclaimed, looking out over the muslin blinds, "and Inspector Cloutson with him. Look at 'em walking together so confidential like." "I'd like to know what they're saying," Mr. Craske confessed. "Heads almost touching, as you might say. And did you see the inspector turn around and look across towards the Hall?" The two men halted outside the postern gate. Presently they separated, and with a brief nod Mr. Johnson entered his own domain, whilst Inspector Cloutson turned and made his way back towards the police station. The little company watched Mr. Johnson's retiring figure as they had once watched his progress down the village street on the day of his first visit. "In my opinion," Rawson declared emphatically, "that's the man who's brought most of the mischief into this neighbourhood. I'm not one to wish any of my neighbours harm, but if the chap who broke into the Great House the other night had been of my way of thinking, he'd have given him one which would have kept him quiet for a bit longer than this." Mr. Johnson moved rather wearily to his favourite seat under the cedar tree, and sat there for several minutes in tired contemplation. He awoke from a fit of brooding to find Catherine Besant crossing the lawn towards him. She was bareheaded, and it was obvious that she had been running. He rose to his feet. "Come and sit down," he begged. "I can't stop," she answered. "I just came in. I wanted to have a word or two with you." He took her hands in his and looked at her steadily. She was a little flushed with her hurrying, but it struck him that her hair was more carefully arranged, and that her linen frock, simple though its fashion, was becoming. The slight eagerness in her manner, communicated also to her expression, gave her an air of greater life and vivacity. "Mr. Johnson," she exclaimed, "I really can't stop. I don't know when Madame may want me. But what does it all mean? Every one seems wildly unhappy, and it all seems to centre round you. What are you doing to everybody? You were so kind to me." "My dear," he replied gently, "it would take a long time to explain. Very soon you will know everything." "But the everything that I am to know seems as though it were going to be horrible," she cried. "Madame looks as if she were about to die every moment. Sir Bertram rode away from seeing her this morning looking like a ghost. They say that Mr. Gregory left last night for abroad. Miss Endicott sent 3 notes to him yesterday. I know that she wanted him to come to see her. He wouldn't. And the place seems full of phosphorescence. It's like a pause before a thunderstorm. No one seems to know quite what to expect. Is it you who have been stirring up all this trouble?" He shook his head. "The trouble, such as it is," he assured her solemnly, "was caused by those who must suffer for it." "Who are they?" she demanded. He pointed over his shoulder towards the Hall. "The Ballastons," he answered. "But what have they done?" He shook his head. "Don't ask me too much," he begged. "It's an ugly story, and you'll know it soon enough. Only believe me, it isn't I who am bringing it all about." "But you could stop it," she expostulated. "Nothing in the world could stop it," he answered. "I don't look like a superstitious man, do I, Miss Besant?" "I shouldn't have said so," she admitted. "I have this belief, though," he went on, "which you may call superstitious or you may not. There are some things which a man who meddles with must suffer for. I have seen it in my younger days in Egypt, and I have seen it also in China. I have seen a man who posed as a great savant and Egyptologist destroy a sacred tomb. The newspapers of the world were filled with accounts of the treasure he discovered. He died within a few months, and to this day no one knows how. And then tell me this, by what right does a young man like Gregory Ballaston, simply because he has courage and enterprise, and because he is faced with ruin, dare to come out to a strange country, break into a sacred temple and rob it? Well, he found no treasure, but for the evil which has come because of his wrongdoing, you must not blame me who point the finger to his guilt. You must blame something which neither you nor I fully understand, but which is working for a punishment just as surely." "But you don't think," she faltered, "you can't believe that Gregory Ballaston killed Mr. Endicott?" "The law will have to decide that," he answered gravely. She sat for several moments, pensive and still. Then she rose to her feet. "I think it is all very horrible," she sighed. "Life has its grim and terrible side," he declared, "but underlying it all there is a sense of justice which has made us humans frame laws and institute a code of punishment. The instinct to do this and abide by the results is a part of nature itself. No one really escapes the consequences of ill doing. Will you promise me one thing, Miss Besant?" She had been in the act of turning away. She paused. "Everything may be changed here in a few days," he went on, "and of course I may be pretty unpopular. Will you promise me that you will not go away without seeing me?" She hesitated for a moment. Then she gave him her hand quickly. To his surprise there were tears in her eyes. "I promise," she said. "You have been kind to me at any rate. You are the first person who has been really kind to me for years." She moved away too quickly for him to detain her. Mr. Johnson returned slowly to the house, over which the shadow of tragedy seemed once more to be brooding. End of Book 3, Chapter 12. Book 3, Chapter 13 of Stolen Idols. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stolen Idols by E. Phillips OPPENHEIM. Book 3, Chapter 13. "Doing me well for our farewell dinner, Dad," Gregory murmured appreciatively as he set down his glass with a little gesture of reverence. "70 port." Sir Bertram smiled pleasantly. It was not for the two footmen standing motionless at either end of the magnificent sideboard, or even for Rawson behind his master's chair, to know that this was anything but an ordinary function. Conversation throughout the meal had taken no account of possible catastrophe. They had talked of the sporting side of Gregory's expedition. Sir Bertram himself had shot big game in Canada more than once. "There are only a few bottles left, I regret to say," Sir Bertram remarked. "We started on the last bin at the commencement of the year." "This is the Cockburns' shipping," Henry put in. "We have always considered it the finer wine. If you will pass the decanter, Bertram, I will indulge in my second glass." Before the decanter was finished Rawson and his satellites had departed. Sir Bertram glanced at his watch. "You have nearly an hour," he said. "What time did you tell Holmes you would leave?" "At 10 o'clock," Gregory replied. "The train leaves Norwich at 11:30." Sir Bertram rose from his place. They strolled into the library, drank coffee and liqueurs, and lit cigarettes. There was still nothing in their conversation to indicate the great crisis. Henry was the first to introduce a note of unexpectedness. "If I may claim 10 minutes of your time, Gregory," he said, "it would gratify me if you would pay a visit to my room. You too, I trust, Bertram," he added. "Why, of course, Uncle," Gregory acquiesced. "I'll just fill my case with these cigarettes, if you don't mind, Dad. May save me opening my travelling bag." "By all means," his father begged. They ascended the great staircase, Gregory pausing every now and then to look at one of his favourite pictures. Henry led the way to his own room, with its quaint air of monasticity and severity, accentuated by the oriel-shaped windows. He closed the door carefully behind him. "I should like, before you depart, Gregory," he began, "to assure you that my sympathies have been entirely with you in your gallant but non-successful attempt to restore the fortunes of our family. I may or may not agree with you in your decision that these," he waved his hand towards the two images, "should remain unbroken. There are times," he went on, "when I fancy that our friend there with the very evil and mocking leer is trying to boast of the treasures he possesses, and with which he refuses to part. That, however, is an effort of the imagination in which I seldom indulge. It occurred to me further that I should like, before you leave, to prove to you that my sympathy with your enterprise was not confined to a merely passive attitude. My actions may not have been entirely judicious, but they were well intentioned. It was I who on a certain night made use of your key, entered the great house in, I must confess, a surreptitious manner, relieved myself of interference on the part of Mr. Johnson, I am afraid in somewhat inconsiderate fashion, and purloined the manuscripts, which I had hoped might help us towards the discovery of the treasure." The cigarette which Sir Bertram had been holding between his fingers slipped on to the carpet and lay there almost unnoticed. He gazed at his brother with a great astonishment in his face. Gregory, taken even more by surprise, stared at him speechless and open-mouthed. Neither of them said a word. Henry stooped down, picked up the lighted cigarette, and threw it into the fireplace. "Henry, you're crazy!" Sir Bertram exclaimed at last. "Uncle Henry!" Gregory cried. Something which was finally a smile parted Henry's lips as he pointed to a neat package upon the table. "These are the manuscripts," he said. "I regret to say that my expedition was a failure. Nothing there helps us in any degree." "But how the devil do you know?" Gregory demanded. "Whom did you get to read them?" "During the last few months," his uncle confided, "with a view to making this enterprise a success, I have studied and read Chinese." "God bless my soul!" Sir Bertram gasped. "The language presented its difficulties," Henry admitted. "During my last visit to London in January I consulted a Chinese scholar who put me in the right way, and I have attained a certain proficiency, enough at any rate for the purpose. It struck me that Major Holmes's enquiries into the matter were becoming somewhat unpleasant, and I thought therefore that I would confide the truth to you, in case at any time suspicion should fall upon another person. This parcel containing the documents contains also a letter from me acknowledging my exploit, and a letter of apology to Miss Endicott, whose property I suppose they must be considered. They are undamaged, and except for the slight injury to Mr. Johnson, which I regret was necessary, the affair seems to me to be trivial." Gregory clasped his forehead. "Trivial!" he groaned. "There will, I fear, be a certain loss of dignity, should I be called upon to answer for my misdoing," Henry concluded, "but I can assure you that I shall take no steps to evade any action which may ensue. That, I think, is all. It only remains for me, Gregory, to wish you success abroad. Of our own future here we will not speak. Whilst the Ballaston treasures and heirlooms remain intact, my place is with them. A pleasant voyage, Gregory." He shook hands and conducted them courteously to the door. His little pat on his nephew's shoulder was the nearest approach to affection he had ever shown. Gregory and his father descended the stairs almost in silence. When they reached the hall, Gregory sank into a chair and held his head in his hands. "Dad, was that a dream?" he demanded. "I can't conceive it. Uncle Henry, of all men in the world!" "It is the Ballaston spirit concealed," Sir Bertram murmured. For a quarter of an hour or so father and son sat in the great hall without speech. There was a curiously intense silence, broken only by the ticking of a large clock and, through the wide-flung window, the twittering of a nightingale preparing for his aftermath of song. Sir Bertram rose at last to his feet. "Let us walk on the terrace, Gregory," he suggested. "The car will be round in a few minutes." They strolled out together, Sir Bertram correct and debonair from the polish of his well-brushed hair to the pearl studs in his shirt and his scrupulously cut dinner clothes; Gregory in travelling tweeds, prepared for his journey. Sir Bertram took his son's arm as they commenced their leisurely promenade. "I am afraid," he said, in a tone of very rare gravity, "that it's all up with us Ballastons, Gregory. You're young and fit, though, and I've got quite enough to amuse myself with. It will have to be France, I suppose, or Spain. It's all a compromise, of course, and a cursed compromise. There's only one place for an Englishman to live, and that's on his own land. It's the devil's own luck to lose Ballaston, but we've gone the limit, eh, Gregory, to try to keep it?" "Yes," Gregory admitted. "We made a bid for it, at any rate. Even Uncle Henry." His tone had grown more serious. The shadow of something unspoken seemed to be lying between them. "Personally," Sir Bertram continued, "I regret nothing. I blame nobody for anything. I consider that everything was justified. You have to make a fresh start, Gregory. Don't do so with that somewhat bourgeois impediment, a slurred conscience. What has been done, and is finished with." Gregory for a moment did not reply. His puzzled eyes sought his father's, but sought them in vain. "For my part," Sir Bertram repeated steadily, "I regret nothing. It was worth the effort. And as for Henry, God bless him." The lights of the car flashed from the stable yard. "And so, my dear boy," his father concluded in his ordinary tone, "you swing your bundle, figuratively speaking, at the end of your stick, and set out on your allegorical journey. Only for God's sake don't come back Lord Mayor of London." Gregory had already taken his seat. The chauffeur's hand was upon the change speeds gear when Rawson hurried forward. "There's another car coming up the avenue, sir," he announced. "Would it be as well to wait for a moment?" Gregory looked out of the window. He could see the twin lights flashing in the distance, gleaming slantwise through the trees, then again pools of light in the semi-darkness. For only a moment he hesitated, but during that moment it seemed to him that he was taking leave of much that was dear in life. Then he stepped out of the car and stood upon the edge of the terrace. "It might be as well, Rawson," he agreed, with somewhat elaborate casualness. "I wonder who the devil it can be at this time of the night," Sir Bertram speculated. The car resolved itself into shape. Its very crudity, its ugliness, seemed symbolic. The driver was in plain clothes, but he sat stiffly, and there was something official about his appearance. By his side was Major Holmes. Behind sat Inspector Cloutson. The two latter descended as the car drew up. "Well, Major," Sir Bertram exclaimed, "what new thunderbolt are you going to launch?" The Chief Constable rather avoided his eyes. "We want a word with you, please," he confided, laying his hand lightly upon Gregory's arm. They all entered the house together. Sir Bertram led the way to the library, thrust open the door, and closed it again when they had all entered. "Now what the devil is it this time, Holmes?" he asked, a little testily. "You mustn't be annoyed with me if I say that I am getting rather tired of these visitations." "I deeply regret the necessity for the present one," was the grave reply. "Gregory Ballaston, I am sorry to tell you that Inspector Cloutson here has a warrant for your arrest. I should strongly advise you to make no reply to the charge and to come with us to Norwich." "What is the charge?" Gregory demanded. "A very serious one, I am afraid," Major Holmes announced. "I have, as a matter of fact, two warrants. The first charging you, Gregory Ballaston, with assault on one Peter Johnson and burglary at the Great House on the night of July 28th, and the second by which you stand charged with the murder of Ralph Endicott at the Great House on June 30th of last year. There is nothing to be gained by denial or comment or anything else at the present moment. I beg you, Gregory, not to attempt any reply, but to come with us." The door behind had been opened so softly that no one heard it. They were all standing motionless when Henry, with a brown paper parcel under his arm, entered. "But that is ridiculous, Major Holmes," he said quietly. "You must have been very greatly misled. It was I who was guilty of the burglary. Here in this parcel you will find all the documents I purloined, or I might say borrowed, the instrument with which I cut out the panel of the door, another with which I picked the lock, instruments I may say obtained with the greatest possible difficulty from an establishment in London." There was a moment's blank silence. Major Holmes's expression, after the first shock of surprise, was one of complete incredulity. "This is a very remarkable statement on your part, Mr. Ballaston," he observed. "I presume you wish us to take note of what you say? At the same time, I have, I am sorry to remind you, a warrant against your nephew on a more serious charge." Henry Ballaston apologized with dignity. "I regret," he said, "not to have mentioned the two affairs together. I also, on June 30th of last year, after a few words of unpleasant discussion with Mr. Endicott, shot him through the head." Once more there was a brief spell of breathless silence. Henry Ballaston was entirely master of the situation, perfectly self-possessed, slightly apologetic. Father and son were gazing into each other's eyes with mutual and amazed interrogation. "You see," Henry continued in explanatory fashion, "Mr. Endicott was a very unreasonable man. He admitted that he had made a translation of the manuscript, but he refused to give it to me. He desired his niece to profit by it. I suppose I must have lost my temper. I shot him and secured the other image, but could find no trace of the manuscript. Hence my second effort within the last few days. Have I made myself quite clear?" Sir Bertram's fingers upon his son's arm had grown like the grip of a vice. He leaned forward. "Do you mean to say that you didn't do it, Greg?" he whispered hoarsely. "Before God, I didn't," was the passionate reply. "I thought it was you." End of Book 3, Chapter 13. Book 3, Chapters 14 and 15 of Stolen Idols. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stolen Idols by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Book 3, Chapter 14. Mr. Johnson, that same evening, was smoking the cigar of discontent, drinking the coffee of bitterness, and sipping the brandy of fire. Around him was all the stillness and the sweetness of the summer twilight which he loved so much, stars burning in a violet sky, the breath of roses in the air, the peaceful village sounds in his ears, more lulling and soothing than absolute silence. Yet he was filled with disquietude. He rose, and with his hands in his pockets paced the long strip of velvety lawn. When he had done, what he had worked for seemed to him to be a simple act of justice, yet with its accomplishment he was acutely conscious of an intense isolation. No one was in sympathy with him. Every one loved the wicked Ballastons. Even Catherine Besant had left him, her eyes streaming with tears. Madame had sent imploring but vain messages. In the village he felt that it was barely safe to show himself. Then, when he was wondering where to look for consolation, the postern gate opened quickly. Two women entered, Catherine Besant and Claire. He moved forward to welcome them. "Miss Endicott," Catherine explained, "wants to see you immediately and talk to you. Take her away somewhere. I will wait." "I am pleased to talk to Miss Endicott anywhere she wishes," Mr. Johnson acquiesced. "In the study, quickly," Claire begged. She swung round upon him as soon as they had entered the room, superb, beautiful, but furious. "Mr. Johnson," she began, "I have come to beseech you, to insist that you move no further in this horrible affair. Nothing can bring my uncle back to life. Nothing can ever still the remorse of whoever killed him. Beyond that let it rest. I implore you, Mr. Johnson, to do nothing more." "My dear young lady," he replied gravely, "think of what you are proposing. You can scarcely be content to let your uncle's murderer go scot free." "That is just what I want to do," she persisted. "He gained nothing by it, and I am quite sure that whoever it was, he was not altogether sane. Even on the steamer, Mr. Johnson, I beg you to believe me, Gregory Ballaston was under the influence of that horrible Image. All the time he behaved quite strangely. As soon as he had parted from it, he was as different as possible. If whoever killed my uncle came from the house where that Image is, it's a terrible thing to say, but I honestly believe it, they couldn't help it, they weren't responsible." The tenant of the great house shook his head. "It is too late," he said. "What do you mean too late?" she demanded with a sudden fear in her eyes. "What have you done? What right have you to interfere anyway? Gregory Ballaston is going abroad tonight. That is the best thing that could happen." "It is nevertheless too late," Mr. Johnson declared. "The local police have consulted with Scotland Yard by telephone, and they have decided that the evidence they hold at present against Gregory Ballaston is sufficient for them to stop his going abroad. They have issued 2 warrants tonight. He will be arrested, I should say, within the next few minutes." She seemed suddenly to tower above him, white, passionate, menacing. Her eyes blazed, her fingers seemed to seek a weapon. It was the first vital fury of youth. "You brute!" she exclaimed. "Oh, Gregory!" For a moment the earth seemed to darken around her. Mr. Johnson groaned as he led the half fainting girl to a couch. "Miss Endicott," he said, "this is a terrible business, but believe me, justice must be done. Murder is an unforgivable crime. To take another man's life, have you thought what it means?" "What about my life?" she moaned. "Don't you understand? I was content never to see him again. I lied about the Image to save him, but I love him. If this horrible thing happens, I think that I shall kill you. I shall either do that or die myself. I can't bear it, I tell you. I can't bear it." She leaned forward in her chair and began to sob. Mr. Johnson mopped his forehead feverishly. It was perhaps in his eager desire to escape from the horror of the moment that he took particular note of the long key which was attached to the chain which hung around her neck, and which had temporarily escaped its resting place. "What key is that?" he asked her sharply. She took no notice at first. He repeated his question. She looked as though she could have struck him. "Key!" she echoed scornfully. "What does it matter? Why do you ask me about keys at a moment like this? There's only one thing that matters. He must be saved. You must do something. Take back something you have said. Of course I know he did it, or I should be with him at this moment. He's not bad. He mustn't be killed. Oh, my God!" She began to sob again. He laid his hand upon her shoulder. "Listen," he said. "I will do all that I can, I promise you. But you must tell me what this key is. I have a reason for asking." "It came from some safe makers about 11 months ago," she answered wearily. "They said it was the duplicate which my uncle had ordered the last time he was in London." He removed the chain from her neck, crossed the room and entered the little annex, the door of which, since the burglary, had stood open, and where, in a corner, a rusty old safe had been fitted into the wall. At the first turn the key slipped in and the lock yielded. He swung the door open. In the darkness there was a gleam of a bulky white envelope. He took it out. It was addressed to Claire Endicott. He examined it for a moment, then he closed the safe and returned to the library. "Miss Endicott," he announced, "that key of yours has solved something which has puzzled me for a very long time. It has opened the old safe here. The other key to it was inside. This letter, as you see, is for you. I have always felt convinced that your uncle, before his death, had succeeded in making some sort of a translation of the document which he possessed, indicating the whereabouts of the jewels. This is probably the solution." She flung the letter away, and, but for his intervention, would have trampled it with her foot upon the floor. "Do something," she begged. "You must stop what is going to happen. It isn't fair. It isn't right." He rescued the letter and himself broke the seal. She snatched it from his fingers. "Don't waste time," she pleaded. "Do something. Letters. What does it matter about letters?" "It is from your uncle," he told her solemnly. "Probably the last thing he ever wrote." She tore open the envelope with quick, nervous fingers, anxious yet reluctant. She began to read with a sort of sullen indifference. Then she seemed suddenly galvanized into a new and amazingly altered state of living. Mr. Johnson, as he watched her, was terrified. She sprang to her feet and shrieked out at the top of her voice. "Read it! Read it yourself!" she cried, gripping him by the arm so that her fingers bored their way into his flesh. "Read it and tell me that it is the truth. Let me see, too. Spell it out. Read it." Their heads touched. Her breath came hot upon his cheek. She grasped the letter as though afraid it might be torn from her. The Great House, Saturday night. My dear Claire, I went to London this morning with the shadow of a fear, no more. I came back doomed. You can hear all about it, if you like, from Sir Francis Moore, 18 Harley Street. 3 months to live and much suffering. I think not. I shall end it tonight. You will be rich, much richer than you think. Malcolms have my will. You and your aunt will share alike. I enclose in this letter a translation of a document which will tell you, unless the document lies, how to obtain the treasure in the Images. Use it as you will. I have no interest. I should have liked a year or 2 here, but I prefer what is to come to an increase of the agony of which I have already had a foretaste. I hope that you will be happy. Ralph Endicott. He read it through word by word. She repeated them after him. Then a calm seemed to come upon her which was almost unnatural. "Take care of the letter," he enjoined. "Don't lose it." He rushed out across the lawn and through the postern gate. Down the great avenue from the house he could see the lights of 2 cars flashing. He ran on to the crossroads and stood there with arms extended. Presently they swung round the corner, and at the sight of him were brought to a standstill with a grinding of the brakes. In the front one were Major Holmes, Sir Bertram and Gregory. In the rear one XIII and Henry Ballaston. Mr. Johnson gripped Major Holmes by the arm. "Major," he exclaimed, "an amazing thing has happened. You must come round to the Great House at once." Major Holmes frowned. "I am afraid, Mr. Johnson," he said, "it is too late for any sort of intervention. The criminal has confessed." Mr. Johnson was staggered, but still frantically eloquent. "There can be nothing to confess," he insisted. "Come and I'll show you the letter. I'll show you where I found it. You must come. You're in charge of this case. I'm sane. It was I who wanted justice done. You must see what has happened. See the open safe. Read the letter." Major Holmes descended and gave an order to the sergeant behind. Both cars were driven to the Great House. Almost pushed in by Mr. Johnson, they crowded into the library. He pointed to the open safe, visible through the door of the annex. "Miss Endicott had the key," he explained. "I noticed it round her neck tonight. It came a month after Mr. Endicott's death. I opened the safe and found this letter that you must all read. I will swear that it is in Ralph Endicott's handwriting. His niece will swear it. I took it from the safe. Ralph Endicott shot himself. He was dying." "He shot himself!" Gregory gasped. "There isn't a doubt about it," Mr. Johnson declared. "The name of the doctor is there. He was a dying man." Across the room their eyes met, Gregory's and Claire's. It seemed as though nothing could keep them apart. Without conscious movement he was by her side, her hands in his. All the time, with slow, deliberate emphasis, Major Holmes was reading the letter aloud, reading the words penned by a dying man, the supreme yet ghastly irony of which no one properly apprehended in those few minutes of immense relief. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire faltered as soon as she could find words. Gregory glanced behind at the little group and drew her nearer and nearer. A nightmare was passing from his brain. "I thought it was Dad," he whispered under his breath. "What could I do?" "The letter appears to be genuine," Major Holmes decided, looking up with an air of great relief. "And the name of the doctor fortunately provides us with corroborative evidence. But under the circumstances I must confess that I fail to understand Mr. Henry Ballaston's position," he added, turning towards him. The latter coughed a little nervously. "It has never been my custom," he declared, "to countenance any deviation from the truth in others, or to indulge in anything approaching a falsehood myself. I have to admit, however, that on the present occasion I made a false statement, which I beg leave to withdraw. The fact is," he confided, with a touch of that ingenuousness which was one of his characteristics, "I never doubted for a moment that my nephew Gregory, in the interests of the family, was guilty of this misdemeanour. I am a useless person in this world. He is a young man and our direct heir. I did what I thought best." "But the Image?" Sir Bertram demanded in bewilderment. "The second Image of the Soul. How on earth did that get to the Hall?" "I brought it," was Henry's complacent reply. "But when?" Gregory asked helplessly. "On the night of Mr. Endacott's unfortunate decease," Henry replied. "I must confess that on the previous evening I paid a surreptitious visit here. I had no idea on that occasion of purloining the Image, but I was anxious to secure, if possible, a translation of any of the Chinese documents which Mr. Endacott was known to possess, which might assist us towards the recovery of the jewels. I found Mr. Endacott, however, at work, and I was unfortunate enough to disturb him. During his brief absence in the garden, I endeavoured to peruse his papers, but his unexpectedly prompt return forced me on that occasion to abandon the enterprise. On the following evening I saw Gregory leave the house." "I came to see if you were still in the garden," Gregory interrupted, turning to Claire. "Precisely," Henry acquiesced, "but I was not at that time aware of your attachment, nor did I attribute any sentimental purpose to your nocturnal excursion. I followed you, and at the side gate here, after some considerable interval, I heard what I imagined to be a muffled revolver shot. I crept from my place of concealment and entered the library. Mr. Endacott was lying there, quite dead. I listened for a moment. I was perhaps unnerved. I imagined that I heard your retreating footsteps from the anteroom into the courtyard. I listened again. There was nothing to be heard. The Image was lying on the floor by Mr. Endacott's side. He had probably been examining it prior to his lamented action, and the fall of his body had displaced it. I considered. I decided that your nerve, Gregory, had failed you, that having committed the preliminary misdeed, you had hurried away without the Image. I accordingly picked it up and brought it home. I placed it by the side of the other in my room. It has been there ever since. I saw the shock which its presence caused you, my dear brother, you too, Gregory, but I did not think an explanation advisable." Sir Bertram laid his hand upon his son's shoulder. "My God, Gregory," he muttered, I thought of course that it was you." Gregory groaned. "And I," he explained, "as I knew it wasn't I, thought it must be you." "My God, these Ballastons!" Major Holmes exclaimed, with amazed fervour. A wonderful half hour! Sir Bertram had slipped away and was on his knees by Madame's couch. Mr. Johnson, whilst everyone else was talking confusedly, hastened down to the cellar. Gregory led Claire out into the garden. In his hand was the paper she had passed over to him. "The Images," he whispered. "Let's go and find them." They drove in the limousine car, still laden with his luggage, through the scented darkness, back to the Hall. his arms around her, her head resting contentedly upon his shoulder. Whilst she waited, he ran upstairs, to the amazement of Rawson and the footman who had admitted him, and presently returned with the two Images. Rawson met him at the foot of the stairs. His face was full of astonishment and piteous appeal. "You will excuse me, Mr. Gregory, sir," he begged, "if there's any news." Gregory staggered past him, borne down by his burden. "Everything's all right, Rawson," he exclaimed. "Mr. Endacott shot himself. Found out he was going to die anyway. We shall be back, all three of us, to sleep. I may not be going abroad at all. Get yourself a bottle of wine, Rawson. Tell you more about it when we get back." Another drive which seemed to pass like a dream during which the agony of the last hour appeared to fade into nothingness. Then the great house again, the Images upon the library table, and a little crowd gathered around. Mr. Johnson, to whom Gregory had passed the paper, called out the instructions. "You press the right eye of the body," he directed, "and press at the same time the inner lobe of the left ear. Then you move the Image forward 3 times slowly, pressing most at the lowest point. Now then." Gregory obeyed the instructions. At the end of the third movement there was a slight noise inside, like the whirring of a spring. A ticking began. They stood a little distance away. Suddenly the right eye opened, and a stream of what seemed to be red and crystal and green fire came out and discharged itself upon the tablecloth. Every one drew closer, fascinated, breathless, until with a final whirring the shower ended. Mr. Johnson passed his hands over the stones. "The finest emeralds I ever saw," he declared. "There's one diamond there I wouldn't dare to value. Now for the soul. You reverse the process. Press the left eye and the lobe of the right ear." This time, after the whirring ended, the left eye opened, and a slow stream of pink and white pearls fell on to the table. "The tears of Buddha," Mr. Johnson exclaimed. "It's the oldest superstition on the river. When Buddha weeps, the tears are pearls." Again they watched, spellbound. This stream continued even longer than the other one. Then there was a little click, and all was over. The eye slipped back. The Image seemed to smile in beneficent fashion. Claire's fingers tightened upon Gregory's arm. "Without expert advice," Mr. Johnson pronounced in an awed tone, "I wouldn't take less than $1 million for them." "They belong to you, every stone," Gregory whispered to his companion. She laughed up at him. "Does it matter?" she murmured. End of Book 3, Chapter 14. Book 3, Chapter 15. Once more 5 men, from a safe distance behind the muslin curtains, watched the approach towards the village inn of the tenant of the Great House. This time, however, conditions were different. The strip of road lay clean and hard in the grip of a 4 days' frost. There were little pools of ice near the pavement. The trees, leafless and stark, stood motionless against the clear sky. Although it was early in the afternoon, the sun was already sinking beneath a bank of ominous-looking clouds. Mr. Johnson, in thick tweeds and leggings, with a powdering of snow upon his coat, carrying a gun over one shoulder and a cartridge bag suspended from the other, made his appearance coming along the lane from the Hall. "He do be a changed man, that, for sure," Mr. Pank observed. "And for that matter," Mr. Craske put in, "his wife be a changed woman. I mind when she used to come in for groceries for Madame, always looking a little tired, almost sulky like, as though there were nothing in life worth caring about. Now I do call her one of the best looking women in these parts. It's worth going a mile to see her and Mrs. Gregory together, either on horseback or out with the beagles." "They say," the innkeeper began. "Hush!" Rawson interrupted. "I believe he's coming in." Mr. Johnson had hesitated at the corner and glanced at his watch. Instead of taking the turn to the Great House, he swung towards the inn, and, pausing for a moment outside to look down the breech of his gun, entered with a cheery greeting. Rawson at once stood up. The newcomer good-humouredly waved him back to his seat. "Don't let me disturb anyone," he begged, finding a convenient corner for his gun and relapsing into the easy chair which had been discreetly vacated by Mr. Craske. "I'll take a warming drink, if you please, Mr. Pank. A wineglass full of sloe gin, if you have it, and if any of you gentlemen will join me, I shall be proud. I forgot my flask this morning." "You've been out along with Mr. Gregory, sir?" Rawson enquired. "We've been after snipe on the mere side. Good sport, but chilly. I've shot snipe in China before now, but they don't seem in such a hurry as these Norfolk devils. Mr. Gregory wiped my eyes more than once." "Mr. Gregory's a fine shot at what I may call the irregular birds," the butler ventured, "snipe and woodcock and such like. You'll pardon me saying so, though, sir, I'd rather see you at the pheasants. I've noticed the last twice that the Squire's put you at the awkward corners." "Well, well," Mr. Johnson admitted, "it's a great life this, if I could only learn to stick on a horse. Mr. Fould, you'll have to keep your eye open for another one up to my weight. I had to miss a day's hunting last week." "I'll do that with pleasure, sir," the veterinary promised. "There's a sale at Norwich next week. I'll be over yonder, surely." Mr. Johnson drank his sloe gin and held out the glass for replenishment. "Good warming stuff," he pronounced. "By the by, you may all like to know that I heard from the Squire this morning. They found the villa at Cannes in great shape, and her Ladyship has walked a mile every day since they've been there." "It do seem wonderful," the innkeeper declared. "A most amazing recovery," Mr. Craske echoed. "To see her lying on that chair month after month, no one would ever dream that she'd end her days marrying and walking about like anyone else. There's been a many changes in these parts, Mr. Johnson, sir, since you come?" The latter nodded his head thoughtfully. "There have indeed," he agreed. "One did feel 6 months ago," the grocer continued, "as though some sort of cloud were hanging over the village, what with the poor gentleman as we thought had been murdered, and the police acting so suspicious like round the place, and all the time talk about the Hall and the Ballaston lands coming under the hammer, and you, Mr. Johnson, not half the cheerful gentleman you are now, looking so solemn as though you had something on your mind all the time, if one might make so free." "Things have changed, certainly," Mr. Johnson acquiesced, knocking out the ashes from his pipe and relighting it preparatory to departure. "The Ballaston mortgages, for instance, as every one knows, have been paid up to the last farthing, and enough left over from Mr. Gregory's little enterprise to keep every one in comfort for the rest of their lives. No talk nowadays, either, of having to sell the old pictures or bits of china that weren't heirlooms. There's Mr. Henry up at Christie's once a month looking for missing pieces. He's starting a new catalogue the first of the year. And the poor gentleman as was supposed to have been murdered found to have shot himself," Mr. Foulds remarked. "That sort of lifted a weight from the place." Mr. Johnson took up his gun. "Well," he said, "we certainly seem in smooth water now. I'm afraid I was rather an unpopular resident at one time." "Mr. Craske was the only one on us," the innkeeper rejoined with a grin, "as had any complaint. He did say when you came as he was hoping for a family man." The tenant of the Great House turned and faced the little company. There was a twinkle in his eyes and a gleam of mutual understanding passed between them. "Well," he exclaimed good-humouredly, "this is no sort of a place for keeping secrets. You'll have another health to drink before long, I hope. Good afternoon, every one." He took his leave, and they watched him from behind the muslin blinds as he walked briskly up the lane and entered his domain by the postern gate. "That do seem to me to be a proper sort of man," the innkeeper declared emphatically. End of Book 3, Chapter 15. End of Stolen Idols by E. Phillips Oppenheim.